Welcome to the program. Greta Uehling joins us today. She is a cultural anthropologist from the University of Michigan, and she's recently released a book called Everyday War, a look at how the Ukraine war is impacting civilians on the ground, their daily experiences, and the cataclysmic changes and how they relate to one another, which is really what anthropology is all about. Her book takes a cultural, ethnic, political, and social look at how that conflict is affecting Ukrainians. And these are everyday people, not necessarily soldiers, although many of the people have families who are in the fight itself. But from anybody who may be keeping a business open or just trying to figure out how to provision any goods for themselves, or they live in a part of the country that isn't having active fighting, but you're living in a country with people that you know who are in danger and who are in active war zones. So, this is a book that covers everything from the stresses on those relationships due to military service, let's say, to how Ukrainians have built impactful community bonds to try to figure out how they survive as a community. She takes individual experiences and gives them context against the background of this fighting, this reality. And Greta will talk to us about how, as cataclysmic as war is, once it becomes your normal, there is such a thing as developing a sort of a new normal, living in a war zone, living in a country under constant bombardment. Once it happens for long enough, you start to live with it as your reality. And if you're young enough, it becomes the only reality you've ever really known or understood. When a conflict goes past a year or two, it becomes a formative part of your life. Now, she began her research in this region in the 1990s, and I think she began cataloging some of the changes specifically in the Crimean region. And those who are familiar with this part of the world, there has been an active conflict in Ukraine now for going on 10 years, with active fighting and the taking of territory. But even before that, there were non-military squabbles and conflicts and political upheavals in this part of the world that had effects on everyday life for people. She's previously researched how persecution and inter-ethnic tensions have shaped this entire area, all kinds of different groups who live here. It's not as simple as Russians and Ukrainians, and we'll talk a little bit about those distinctions in the show. So she joined us for this discussion because you know the news. This program is not designed to give you breaking news about any given geopolitical issue or international current affairs. We're here to talk about trends, and unfortunately, one of the trends in our world is war. Massive, significant conflicts displacing tens of thousands, if not millions, of people, and those who are living through war zones in a way that we haven't seen in the world in a long time. Certainly not in large active front lines the way we see in Eastern Europe today. So I thought it was important that rather than go through the headlines of this conflict and try to understand the players and the goals of the combatants, this is really a moment to think about everyday life and the lessons that we can learn from people who are living through a war. God forbid that ever comes to our homes and our shores, wherever you may be listening to this program. And who better than an anthropologist, somebody who literally studies people for a living, to give us an insight, to talk to the people who are living through this on a daily basis, how they cope, how they work with each other, how they think about each other, how every aspect of their relationships with their communities, with their blood relatives, with the loves of their lives for that matter, how all of this is impacted and painted by this conflict, by the perceptions of the conflict, by the realities of everyday life and the things that used to be easy to do that are now impossible, by the travel that used to be a given and now is, in some cases, very dangerous. And also the reality of being forced from your home, but still living in your own country and spending time with relatives who may have a different view of the conflict from your own. There's a lot for us in the international community to learn from this, because wherever you're listening to this show from, whether it's Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, Latin America, North America, wherever you're listening to this program, hopefully you're in a place of peace. Hopefully there's no conflict going on where you are, but understand that a couple of years ago, most of Ukraine wasn't a conflict zone either. Most of the country was being frequently visited by business people and tourists alike. There were no bombs falling, and yes, there were political tensions like there are anywhere, but it didn't explode into violence and mass loss of life. I hope it doesn't come to any of you anywhere, but if you live long enough and you live in any part of the world that has a potential for conflict, it is at least possible that you too may live through a war. Many of your parents, grandparents, or great grandparents did live through periods of war. Certainly, all of the listeners of this program throughout pretty much any country in Europe, the vast majority were affected by one of the world wars. And the same is true in Asia and across much of the rest of the world. And even in more recent times, for our listeners across the Middle East, there have been significant conflicts that have displaced large numbers of people, both those induced by internal divisions and those brought by powers from beyond their shores. So I think it's important to keep the humanity of the situation. And that's what this interview is all about. That's what Greta is going to help us do. So at the end of the program, I'll give you a quick recap on what we talked about and a reminder about her book. But I hope that you'll enjoy this conversation about the everyday lives of Ukrainians living in a war zone and the realities that they face. And hopefully, it brings some perspective that you haven't heard anywhere else. And you may not hear anywhere else on our mainstream news, and perhaps not even on other programs that take an in depth look at this conflict from a mostly political and military angle. So, I invite you to stick around for the next hour and enjoy my conversation with cultural anthropologist from the University of Michigan, Greta Uehling. Greta, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Okay, so let's begin with your background. You're a cultural anthropologist. Tell us what that means, what you study, a little bit about your background, and then we'll talk a little more about your experiences specifically in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. You're correct. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and what that means is I study living human communities. I feel like the beauty of anthropology is that the tools enable you to step inside other people's worlds for however long or however briefly, and experience things a little bit more closely to the ways in which they do. And so Anthropology has the power to give people an inside view of the experience of people who are maybe quite different from oneself.
And it's very timely. I think that we're discussing this topic in the context of Ukraine, because unfortunately there are conflicts around the world, and you've had a chance to really study that one in particular, and it might give us all some insights as to what other people are going through. But we'll spend most of today's conversation specifically on Ukraine. Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this and how you got started, because I know you've been working on this long before the invasion of 2022.
Hmm. Yeah, I became interested in Ukraine for the first time when I did a language study abroad program to the western part of Ukraine, and was just fascinated by what I found there because I was sent over to study Russian, and when I got there, people said, well, you could speak French and you could speak Japanese, but don't speak Russian. It's very dangerous to speak Russian right now. You'd be better off speaking Ukrainian, because this was at a time of separatist demonstrations. And so I got very interested in the ways that history was impacting people's personal relationships and the way they related to people who were both close to them and perhaps just colleagues at work or shopkeepers that they encountered in the course of their day, and that led to an honors thesis as an undergraduate, and then of course I continued those studies as a graduate student in anthropology.
What surprised you, aside from things like language, about the culture that you encountered versus what maybe you thought you were going to see when you got there?
Well, that's a really interesting question because in this latest research, I was studying the effects of war and conflict on Ukrainians. And one of the things that struck me first was the way in which civilians were responding to the war by really engaging in it very directly. And that's actually how the book came to be called Everyday War, because everyday war refers to this way in which people engaged very consciously and very creatively with the war that was going on around them. Maybe the best example is this young woman I met named Alexandra, who had dropped out of university to provision her father, who was a volunteer in a battalion fighting in the East. And his task was to be a sniper. And Alexandra knew very well that the people that he would have in his sights would be former neighbors and former friends. But his safety and survival was paramount. So instead of going to university or spending lots of time with her friends, she spent her time raising money to buy him things like tactical gloves and night vision goggles so he could be a safer sniper. And so that was a big surprise that there was this very pragmatic self defensive stance in places where international humanitarian law had been upended. Um, I think there were other dimensions that really surprised me as well, which is that, I had this idea about war that was based on Hollywood movies, essentially, action films. I had this idea that war unfolded like a Hollywood action film. And so I was quite surprised when I saw firsthand the way that it unfolds much more slowly, methodically, deliberately than one might imagine. And so I think that the person that brought that home for me most clearly was a man named Carrillo, who was a humanitarian. And he asked me, well, do you want to go to the red, the yellow, or the green zone in Ukraine? Because these levels of risk that he was using to calibrate the violence were very practical for him as a humanitarian. And he could really, at a pretty fine uh, grained level, calibrate what would be needed for, depending on the proximity to the violence. And of course, there were people and families with children who lived inside that red zone, showing how war was really affecting everybody.
So when we think about Ukraine pre-invasion, post-invasion, it's a bit of a misnomer, right? Because they had been in conflict since 2014 actively, and there has been constant issues, international issues, particularly with Russia. So, what did you observe about the Ukraine cultural dynamic before all of these events? Let's start with maybe 2014, in that period between 14 and 22, and then after. It feels like that's a generation of conflict that people had to adapt to. But Ukraine is a giant country, and how people were experiencing it in the East was different than how they would have experienced it in Kyiv and in Lviv. And I know that's sort of a big question for a big country, but as an anthropologist who looked at this culturally, I'm curious what you saw about the progression of that society and those communities over time.
That's a really good question, actually. And you're right in pointing out that actually this war began in 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and escalated with the full scale invasion in 2022. If we think about that period that began in 2014, and reached to 2022. One of the things that is important about it is that you're absolutely correct. What was going on in the East was very different than what was going on in the West. And then with 2022, and I can say a little bit more about that in a second, but really with 2022, what happens is the entire country becomes far more unified in its struggle against this external aggressor and its mission to survive. So the key word is, the country becomes far more unified in its struggle after the full scale invasion. Um, but if we go back to like 2014 to 2022, um, I think that a man named Yuri provided a really good snapshot for what was going on, because he had fought as part of a volunteer battalion in the East for a number of years, and then demobilized and moved to the western part of the country. And he was very struck by how the people in the western part of the country wanted to just go on with their lives as if war wasn't being waged in the eastern part of the country. And what he did about that, and this also speaks to that everyday kind of war that I mentioned, was he opened a war themed cafe that was kind of like along the lines of a hard rock cafe that is intended to be very interactive and experiential, to help familiarize the people in the western part of the country with the reality of the people in the eastern part of the country. And when he demobilized, he found that there was some distrust of veterans. They had reputations for being, for their post-traumatic stress, that they were too, perhaps too emotional. And so in this cafe, what he tried to do was establish a better dialogue between people who had experienced the war directly, and people who might prefer to forget about it. So he had a real Kalashnikov on a table that you could pick up. The ceiling was decorated with these, bazookas hanging down. In order to pick up a napkin, you had to grab a deactivated landmine that was serving as a paperweight, and that was his way of trying to both provide veterans with work opportunities, but also create a site for better dialogue.
So one of the interesting parts about watching this from the outside, I'm based in the United States, so we get a filtered view of what's happening in conflict zones. But from the outside looking in, you get the sense that there is a total commitment, total mobilization to defend Ukraine. Starting in 2022 with the full scale invasion, you get men who are effectively drafted into the forces, and then you have a significant amount of refugees who some are being internally displaced, some are leaving. And at the superficial level, we sort of absorb that news, but we don't really absorb it at the human level. We don't really understand what that means when a family has its men go and serve in uniform. The women and children, maybe they stay, maybe they have to flee, but entire families get separated in that process. And in and of itself, this causes a tremendous amount of stress and trauma. I'm curious of the folks that you spoke with and the families that you had a chance to connect with. How do you handle that as a society when literally entire communities are half are going to war and half are having to flee? How do they stay connected in that environment? How do those communities persevere?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. I think you're very accurate when you say that the entire country is unified behind this war effort. But what your question is pointing us to is something that I actually explore quite deeply in the book, in the sense that we know so much about the geopolitical dimensions of war, and we know so much about individual psychological trauma. There's very rich literature on that topic. But what I think is very important and also missing in many discussions is that the geopolitical um, uh, crisis has been accompanied by an interpersonal crisis in which families, friendships, and romantic relationships have all been deeply affected by war. And so in the book, I talk about this as the war sort of refracts through different kinds of interpersonal relationships. And there were two main responses, right? Like in some cases, when people found that they disagreed politically, it meant the the end of the friendship, right? I call this like the politicization or the nationalization of friendship, in which if you were divided by politics, it meant that you no longer had a relationship with that person. But there was also a strong tendency to depoliticize relationships. But that too came at a cost because that meant that you might not be able to talk about some of the things that were most meaningful for you. And so I found in my research, I did 150 interviews across all regions of Ukraine, and I found that the majority of the people I spoke with, about 70%, lamented the loss of friendships and new tensions within family relationships. A perfect example of that is a woman named Larissa who had grown up in the eastern part of the country, but accepted a job in the western part of the country. So she moved there with her son. And when the war began, her son enlisted immediately in this elite airborne division, and sadly, he was shot down within a week of joining the service, and that loss would have been terrible enough, except that Larissa's entire family had remained in the East. And Larissa told me that her mother had financed the Russian authorities that came to power in the East, and her sister actually worked for them. And so, what Larissa's story adds is, we know that war is hell, but what kind of hell is it? And it's a kind of hell in which you cannot call home, you cannot call your mother because she is on the opposite side. And so Larissa decided to sever all contact with her mother and her sister, in favor of leaning into fighting for Ukraine. So that's sort of like the perfect encapsulation of these two responses. And I guess that you could also say that some people, instead of blaming the people in their lives that had taken the opposite political stance, some people blamed the very powerful Russian disinformation campaigns that had a way of profoundly influencing the way that people were thinking in Russian controlled territory.
That's a powerful story, and we don't think often enough about the fact that entire families end up on literally different sides of battle lines, and down to how you are then viewed. I mean, you have a daughter who, if they reach out to their mother, let's say it had gone the other way and they tried to have an ongoing relationship, would that person then be viewed as a collaborator themselves just for talking to their mother who's on the other side of the conflict? And I assume that there is some of this. Where perhaps they're not trying to communicate with each other on military grounds or on any sort of formal support, but they literally want to speak to their family member who just unfortunately happens to be on the other side of a conflict. How does that get balanced in the western part of the country, let's say, where there are people who want to reach out to family members, but but they're on the other side of the conflict, and they just so happen to be related. Is that looked down upon?
I think that people in Ukraine have a diversity of ways of coping with the war and respect each other's choices. But there are many, many, many cases. I think the New York Times counted 11 million families that are split across Russia and Ukraine that are no longer on speaking terms. So I wouldn't say that people look down on each other, but I would say that right now the survival of the country is uh, elevated to such importance that it's often the case that people simply don't, speak to each other. Another element of this is that listeners might not be aware of is that it's not as simple, in the United States or in Western Europe. We simply go online and access the kinds of information that we think might enable us to achieve a well rounded view of a situation. And that's not really possible for the people in Russian occupied territories because their access to uh, information, like objective information about Ukraine or the information that Ukrainians are disseminating about themselves, is simply not accessible, right? Because of the limitations on the internet, and then also, of course, it's a crime. It's a crime to provide aid to the Russian side or to the Ukrainian side, right? Depending on what side you're on, it's a crime to collaborate with the other side. Um,
So then, as we now look at one of the dynamics of this, I'm fascinated by is those who have lived in the occupied territories for this entire period, and the thought processes and the decisions that one has to make when geopolitics wraps you up, whether you like it or not. And what do you do? Do you work with the invading forces? Do you resist against them? Do you stay? Do you flee? And of course, everybody has personal issues that affect the decisions that they make. I'm curious about that dynamic in particular, those living in occupied territories. You mentioned the lack of information they have access to, but what other considerations did you see that those communities had to make as this started to unfold? And we can go back to 2014 when it all began. We can talk about 2022. But for that fairly substantial civilian population that's been living in conflict for a long time, being governed by an occupying force, what are some of the considerations, the day-to-day considerations that they had to make just to live and to try to have some semblance of a normal life?
mm-hmm. You know, I think that a good way to think about it was offered by a psychologist that I interviewed who was working very closely with the people in Russian controlled territories. And what the way she described it was emotional mitosis, an emotional splitting in which the people who are living in these war torn regions stop responding and reacting to the violence going on around them as a way of maintaining a semblance of normality. And the other people observe uh, this tendency and oftentimes reorient their careers around helping those people to um, to cope. And a really good example of this coping would be a man that I interviewed named Danilo, and he lived in the Donetsk Republic during this terrible siege And he didn't flee because his elderly parents, he lived with his elderly parents, and it was very important to him to be able to care for them. So he stayed to care for his parents and went on working. But he slept in his bathtub because that was the room that didn't have any windows. So every night he would sleep in his bathtub. You know, his parents would sleep in the corridor. And then every morning, his job was to repair damaged internet infrastructure. So every morning he'd get up and he'd go to work and he'd repair whatever had been destroyed during the night. And his life went on like that for months. Another really good example would be a man named Pasha who, talked about studying smoke signals from mortar attacks and realized that it took the Russians to about 20 minutes to reload, which was also, importantly, just enough time to exit his apartment, run across the street, and buy bread or milk in that little intervening window of time. Now, of course, sometimes that strategy ends tragically, but it's an example of how people coped. And when it comes to the normalization of war and military violence, I think my humanitarian friend that used the stoplight metaphor also put it well when he talked about it. The sounds of war become like rain and sunshine, right? Or and it becomes like a form of white noise that when it's not there, you feel like something is off, something is strange. Young women told me that they needed that sound to go to sleep because they had become so habituated to the distant sound of mortar fire that it was like that was their new normal. But this is actually, I don't want to make this sound like it's okay. This is shaping a generation of people. And, the way Carrillo put it was that young children learn the calibers of ammunition before they learn the sounds that barnyard animals make. And they learn their way to the bomb shelter before they learn their way to kindergarten. And so that very, very young children, preschool age children, are having to cope with war in ways that will shape their consciousness for their lifetime. And I
What are
think,
s- Go ahead.
mhm.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, we've been talking about how there's this interpersonal crisis, there's this interpersonal dimension to war. And I think that this has very powerful implications for what happens after the war, which is that, the physical infrastructure will be significant but relatively straightforward to rebuild. By contrast, the relational infrastructure of all of these relationships that have been disrupted or ended because of war will be much more difficult to rebuild.
That was going to be my next question, so I'm glad you went there. And I know we can't project the future. We don't know how long this conflict will play out in an active situation, but certainly as we sit here recording in December of 2023, fighting still rages on. That's in the winter months now, but there's every expectation it will continue. But we do have some parts of Ukraine that are less active than others. And where there is relative peace on a daily basis. And yet, as you said, that covers up the underlying reality that people still have members of family actively at war, even if the bombs are not raining on their particular city every day. what have you seen from those parts of the country that are not on the front line or currently occupied, and where there may not be routine attacks, about how life has normalized there, or how they're trying to start to put those pieces back together? And I specifically think of those suburbs north of Kiev that were actively assaulted by the Russian forces at the beginning of this. Eventually, they were pushed out of the country, but those communities are still living with the scars of that, obviously, almost 2 years later. Have you had a chance to speak with people from areas of the country like that, that were in an active hot zone and now are in relative, again, peace is relative in Ukraine these days, and how those communities are starting to put the pieces back together?
Mm-hmm. So, in those regions, you mentioned like the suburbs of Kiev. Yes, I do speak with people in those regions quite regularly. And for them, it's important to continue their work. And I think it might help put things in perspective if we think about the extent to which Mm, everybody has experienced a shift in values. And so they live lives of meaning and purpose around war. That means when the air raid sirens go off, they sleep poorly. They have bomb shelters where there's like a family like atmosphere because they're in there with the same people for months on end in the night, right? And some work gets done there. um, so, uh, one of the arguments I make in the book is that this everyday war produces everyday ethics. These are relational ethics that have to do with care. So we're used to thinking about like ethics as like what rational individuals, making individualized decisions choose to do. That's like the traditional concept of ethics. But what I found was a relational ethics in which people described uh, levels of responsibility for one another that were unprecedented, and caring at levels that were for themselves unprecedented. And this is life changing for many people. The perfect example might be um, uh, Pasha. So Pasha fled the war in the east when it was no longer safe to stay. He goes to a safer region. He's lost everything, but he and his wife start rebuilding this shack with the materials they can scrounge up. And pretty soon, the neighbors started to drop by and ask them if they needed anything. Sure enough, everything from food to building supplies was dropped off. And for Pasha, what this meant was that this existential fear that he had felt his entire life about, like, what happens if my house burns down? What happens if there's a flood? Dissipated. So paradoxically, by losing everything, he gained this very deep sense of security in knowing that no matter what, he would be cared for. And so this is it's life changing. And um, another example would be volunteer body collectors. So in the beginning of the war, Ukraine's military lacked the capacity to collect the war dead. And I know a man who had peacefully retired. He was planning on enjoying his life when the war broke out. And so he joined a group called the Black Tulips that took it upon themselves to drive into Russian occupied areas to collect the dead with, tools and vans that they had supplied themselves with. And so I asked him why, right? Because they had to negotiate with um, armed guerrilla fighters. They drove on mined roads. They slept in the forest. It was um, tremendous hardship and tremendous risk. And he said, well, we do this because, even if we can't bring peace, the least we can do, the absolute least we can do, is bring a little bit of peace of mind to the families that survive these fallen soldiers. We did it because it was the right thing to do, right? Like in his ethical world had been transformed, and suddenly he experienced a level of caring. And then he partnered. There's a Carrillo actually discovered that there was no the Russian occupied territories didn't have pediatric insulin because it was free in the pre-war era. And so here were kids who were having to be like rushed out of Russian occupied territory to get insulin in other areas. And this is, of course, life threatening. And from Carrillo's perspective, these are children. They're not on one side or another. They're children. And so he devised a way to deliver pediatric insulin to hundreds of families. And when I talked to him about this, he told me that for him as well, it had been a revolution in his system of values towards valuing every single human life that hadn't been uh, the case before, when he was a businessman and he economized and he thought about his daily projects in terms of cost to benefit ratio. And that ended with the war, when he came to a new appreciation for the people around him. So I would say that Ukrainians live lives of tremendous value and meaning as best they can. And probably the one thing that we haven't really touched on that's very important here, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, which is that under the martial law, the men stay, and then the women and children become refugees. And of course, that will have a profound effect in the future as well. I talk about this everyday war that split relationships, and in a way that became government state policy with the martial law, in which families become separated, and some of them will reunify, some of them won't. But there'll be a lot of interpersonal infrastructure to rebuild after war.
Is that something that is equally important in your view as the process of rebuilding, literally the physical rebuilding of the country? Because it seems to me that all I hear about, and again, sitting in the United States, I certainly hear about ideas about how we can support, the Western world can support in the rebuilding or the financing of Ukraine's future, but that is a very physical investment. But what you're talking about here is really putting the country's society back together. Um, are there people thinking about that? Is there some sort of an advisory group in Ukraine or in NATO or anywhere else that has experience in post-war sort of cultural reintegration of soldiers to their families and communities back together?
The international community does have some experience with this, particularly learning a great deal from the wars in the former Yugoslavia, where they, determined that, before I was a teaching professor at University of Michigan. I worked for the UN Refugee Agency, so I had some exposure to how all of this worked. But there are systems in place for post-war reconstruction. What I would submit to you is that it's a question of emphasis, and that perhaps more emphasis needs to be placed on these interpersonal dimensions, which I don't want to say matter more or matter less, but I want to say that they matter for outcomes. And if we think about um, how the war is being waged right now, it matters for survival. So Alexandra um, enabled her father to survive by provisioning him with the right equipment. But it also matters for things like um, information during a blackout, knowing when to flee, or having people that are willing to transport you, from a zone of active military activity. It matters for survival. It matters for um, how the society functions. So Ukrainians are very, very busy in terms of provisioning the areas that are under siege. I know a group of people who decided that they were going to devise a way to make freeze dried Ukrainian soups so that the soldiers could feel nourished on the front, right? So it matters, like, do you get food? Do you get
Mhm.
adequate nutrition? Or who literally bought meat and milk and fresh bread and drove to the conflict zone to distribute these things. So it has to do with, capacity and survival. And it matters in just so many ways.
So one dimension of this we haven't talked about yet, and I am less familiar with. I think my audience might be, so help educate us. Aside from Russian and Ukrainian cultural integration and obviously now separation in Ukraine, I assume there are other ethnic groups at play in Ukraine and their relationships with each other pre-war, during war, and I guess we'll see what happens in the future. Could you give us a little background or a little bit of color on all the different, or at least some of the major different ethnic groups that exist within Ukraine and how they've been getting along before all this conflict and now during?
Hmm. What a wonderful question. In addition to Russians and Ukrainians in Ukraine, Ukraine also has several indigenous people, the most numerous of which are the Crimean Tatars, many of whom were displaced by the 2014 occupation of Crimea. And there too, um, the there are some very important and interesting dynamics which will shape the future because, whereas most Ukrainians kind of viewed Crimea as this distant land where, there was ocean and mountains and it might be good to go that far for vacation, they didn't really seriously consider the Crimean Tatars as Ukrainian. And with the occupation, paradoxically, Ukraine woke up to the significance of the Crimean province and the Crimean Tatars, who are indigenous to the Crimean province, for Ukraine as a whole. And so, there too, we see the integration of the country as opposed to its fragmentation. And I think it would be helpful for your listeners to appreciate the extent to which in Ukraine, many people have, like, mixed ancestry and, spoke one or the other languages. But with the full scale invasion, there has been a massive shift away from speaking Russian, which is now the language of the aggressor nation, towards you speaking Ukrainian. And so there's a beautiful, both official and grassroots effort to facilitate this transition, which ultimately will, I believe, strengthen Ukrainian nationhood, right? Where there's pride about the language, there's pride about the culture. So I think that's important. And I also think that expectations about Ukrainians shifting their view of Russians should be extremely conservative because mm, a key lesson from peace and conflict studies is that when shells stop falling and bullets stop flying and people are physically safe, that's not the end of the war. It takes a very, very long time. And I do not see Ukrainians changing their view of Russia in this century. I think it will take centuries to look at Russia in a different light. There have been war crimes, there's genocide, um, there's the abduction of people's children, and those will not be forgotten.
And when you think about that kind of implication of the long-term scars that fundamentally change the makeup of a society and how people relate to one another, um, is this something that gets talked about? Because one of the curiosities I've had about this is, let's say there is some sort of a resolution that does bring Ukraine back to its whole, and it regains the territories that have been occupied. There are people in those territories who are Russian by ethnicity and by culture, and who have their sympathies to the Russian Federation. It's hard for me to see a scenario in which they would stay in Ukraine. Is that being talked about? Is that something that in the rest of the country, in the rest of Ukraine, how will we get along with these people that we have been in a pitched conflict with, even though they may have a heritage that would ostensibly make them Ukrainian, but culturally they've been on the other side of this.
Mm-hmm. Another really important question. And the answer is yes. The Ukrainian government has been thinking about this and actually planning around it. There is a lot of discussion. There are permanent fora and permanent working groups that are devoting full time efforts to precisely this question. And I think you're accurate that many of the people, like assuming that Ukraine regains its all of its former territory, there are many pro-Russian people in those territories who will simply leave for Russia. But then the question becomes the people who remain, right, who've been exposed to Russian disinformation campaigns and Russian state media influence for uh, a decade, um, how to reintegrate that. And the Crimean Tatars have been working with the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, on what they refer to as cognitive deoccupation. And I really like that term because it's about working with people emotionally, interpersonally, psychologically, gradually, like with sensitivity and nuance to realize that um, it's not just a question of changing the leadership of those regions, but also like working with people quite closely. And so there are very detailed plans for how to go about accomplishing that cognitive deoccupation.
Fascinating. So as we come to the end of our hour together, I'm curious about what you feel like that you've learned from studying this part of the world and this culture and this conflict that might apply in the West. We have a global audience, but many listeners in Europe, the U.S., and Canada. What are some of the big lessons learned that you think we can take away sort of in our everyday lives as we think about our own communities and our own families and maybe even in the context of sort of partisanship that we seem to find ourselves in so routinely now over politics and so forth? What are some of those lessons learned that even you carry with you as you go about your daily life?
Hmm. I think the first thing that is important is that this kind of everyday war that springs up when humanitarian law is not observed and war takes place in civilian areas is not confined to Ukraine. And I think that that's important. It's a useful lens when people begin to look at what's happening in Gaza or what's happening in Yemen or what might be happening in Sudan, all of these places where the nature of war has changed, and territory is controlled. First of all, civilians are um, uh, a great deal of contemporary war is waged in civilian areas. So civilians are drawn into war from that perspective. But also, territory is gained not only through military means, but through controlling the information space, like controlling what people think. And that should be, a lesson to Americans about their own media, their own social media, about the importance and significance of diversification within the media landscape is absolutely crucial towards maintaining democracy. Um, so I think that that is an important um, an important lesson, right? That the nature of war has changed, and with it, our ways of coping and responding need to become far more nuanced and far more sophisticated, and so that we are prepared for those dynamics.
The book is Everyday War. If people would like to get a copy, do you have a specific site, or is it your normal? Go to your local bookstore, go to Amazon. What's your preference for folks to get a copy of your book?
The two best places to get it are on Amazon.com. Just type in my last name, Uehling, or Everyday War, and it should pop up. You can also purchase it from the Cornell University Press um, website, again, by just typing in my last name or the title. And then I also have a website that has more information about me and my work, other things I've published, and it's GretaUehling.com.
I will include those links in the description of this podcast. Greta, thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for bringing so many of these anecdotes of the everyday people living everyday lives in a terrible, tragic situation. But their stories need to be told, and I think you've done a wonderful job with that. And I hope people will get a copy of your book and read more about those and your thoughts on what you've observed in that part of our world.
Thank you for having me.
It was a sobering conversation to think about and get in the mindset of somebody living through war. And the idea that while unimaginable to you and I, living in a place of relative peace, it is an everyday reality for those who hear explosions in the distance, who have lost family members and live in the fear that they could be victims themselves, and that everyday activities that you or I take for granted are luxuries and pleasures and huge opportunities for people there. So I hope you'll go back and listen to this program again. I think most of our shows require a second listen, but I really appreciate Greta joining us and telling the stories of the people that she spent time speaking to and, given the nature of her work, researching and giving voice to their stories and to their realities. Let me be clear that this podcast is not designed in any way, shape, or form to push a political viewpoint. We are not here to talk about the justifications or lack thereof of the conflict. We're not here to talk about what any given country's policy towards Ukraine or Russia should be. This program is all about the humanity of the reality behind what's happening, regardless of who did what and in what order these things happened or shouldn't have happened or who should be held accountable for what. That is not what this program is for. And I think it's important that we have spaces like this to talk about the human reality of the news that we experience and the big cataclysmic changes in the world. Because too often we sit back and we have the political debate or we have the geopolitical debate. We talk about the international implications of these things, and we forget that this is all about people. There are people, real, honest to goodness people who live in this part of the world who have to live with the consequences of whatever arrangements and agreements are made when this fighting stops, and whose lives are torn apart and forever altered by the decisions that heads of state make and military leaders make and political leaders and diplomats make. So I hope we brought some humanity to it for you. I hope we took ourselves out of the daily headlines and into the real lives of the people living through this crisis. And without assigning blame or pointing fingers, simply understanding what our fellow humans are going through and the trends that unfortunately have so many more people around the world experiencing conflicts not that dissimilar from the one happening in eastern Ukraine. In our next episode, we're going to take a big deviation from this topic into the world of alternative medicine, we'll say, but really alternative treatment. And Allison Crossweight will join us to have that conversation. I hope you'll join us for that episode because it is a different take on healthcare. We have talked about healthcare on this program. Breakthroughs in healthcare research are a big part of what we want to talk about here because they are such huge trends. But I've noticed an important trend, not just in the celebrity world, but throughout the Western world, of people turning to what we'll call alternative forms of medicine. And Allison's actually got a nice definition for what that means because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But not to say that we don't have an important place for traditional fact-based, science-based medications, therapies, and treatments. But sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes there needs to be something additional. Allison has gone through this personally, and she's made quite the career change and quite the life change. And she wants to help others, and I think she's a very credible source on this issue. So, wanted to bring her on the program, share some of her observations, and see if you find them interesting. But no matter whether they're good for you or not, I think it's important that you know about some of the trends in alternative medicine, alternative treatments, alternative therapies, and some of those that are having real positive effects for people who have to date been unable to be successfully treated by the more traditional and repeatable approach to medicine that's generally practiced across the modern Western world. So that's coming up in our next episode. You can find this episode and all of my episodes going back to episode 1 on my website, brianjmatos.com. I also invite you to follow along with our community on Facebook. You can find me at brian.matos there. I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Brian J. Matos. I usually tweet out at least once a week on the episodes that we're airing. My YouTube channel has become a popular destination for folks who only have time to listen to the 5 or 10 minute clips before they download the whole show. So you can find me at Brian J. Matos Podcast on YouTube. And of course, you can find me anytime, or reach out to me anytime, I should say, by email, info at brianjmatos.com. And I hope you'll subscribe to this program. If you're hearing it for the first time and you're not a subscriber yet, this show is available anywhere and everywhere that you get your podcasts. iHeartRadio podcasts, the podcast network that is Spotify, Apple iTunes, and the Apple Store. You can find us on Amazon Music. You can find us on the Odyssey app. You can find us on the Libsyn app, for that matter. Pretty much anywhere and everywhere that podcasts are available, you can find this program. Thank you once again for joining me for this episode. Look forward to speaking to you again next time. And until then, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.